If my life was a book, a select number of video games would serve as bookmarks to some of its chapters. The original Sakura Wars would definitely be one of those games. There are games that stick with you no matter how much time passes. Oftentimes those are games that you like so much they remind you of moments from your past, the same way a favorite song from high school would. Thoughts of my mom's old room and its gaudy red carpet would always pop in my mind, for example, every time I think of the original 8-bit Ninja Gaiden game on the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Nintendo Famicom, which is what I played on. I can still see my brother handing me the controller every time he made it to the game's final boss. Ah yes, Jackio. That was a pretty tough boss fight. Contra 3, the Alien Wars meanwhile, always reminds me of the first time I arrived in the United States. Back then, I would scale the tall wall behind our condominium so I could take a shortcut to the nearby Target and play the game for free on the store's Super NES console demo unit. And then there's Sakura Wars. Known as Sakura Taisen in Japan, my encounter with the original Saturn game was one born out of both curiosity and necessity. At the time, I started learning Japanese and had amassed a collection of books for my studies. These texts, however, were quite cut and dry, and I needed additional motivation to help things better stick in my head. As someone who loved video games, I thought, why not get a text-heavy game and then use that to learn reading? It just so happens that one of the gaming magazines I read had an ad from a Japanese game importer, and the upcoming Sakura Taisen game was one of the titles it featured. The rest, as they say, is history. Looking back, using Sakura Wars to learn Japanese was like the video game equivalent of throwing a kid in a pool to teach the poor child to swim. I literally spent hundreds of hours looking at words and characters from the game with my trusty Japanese-English dictionary and kanji reference books. The crazy thing is, it actually worked. That first game and the other Sakura Wars games that followed were largely responsible for the quick progress that I made in learning the language. My reading, in particular, improved exponentially. One big reason was that I absolutely fell in love with the series. There was just something about the Sakura Wars formula that got me hopelessly hooked. From its mix of steampunk elements, combined with an early 20th century Tokyo vibe, to the distinct character designs by Kosuke Fujishima, the game's presentation definitely hit the right buttons for me. Add the game's writing, its interactive dialogue system, its tactical RPG combat, as well as its nice selection of minigames, and I found the gameplay quite enjoyable as well. It was almost like an anime, a visual novel, and a strategy RPG all rolled into one. Ueno Park, which was the setting for one of the game's key scenes, actually became one of my first stops when I first visited Japan. That's how much of an impression the franchise made on me. Over the years, the various entries in the Sakura Wars series easily made their way into my list of favorite games of all time. I even imported spin-offs such as the column-style Sakura Wars puzzle games and the more action-oriented Sakura Wars 5 Episode 0 because I couldn't get enough of the series and its characters. For more than a decade, Sakura Wars was a constant presence in my life as a gamer. To say that I was saddened by the series' disappearance after Sakura Wars 5 would be a big understatement. It also came as a big surprise. Back in 1996, for example, the first game in the Sakura Wars series was the second most wanted title in a poll by Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu, behind only Final Fantasy VII. This, by the way, was way back when Final Fantasy was a huge deal in Japan. The early Sakura Wars games also did incredibly well in Japan. Then all of a sudden, the franchise was just gone. For years, I held out hope that Sakura Wars would make a return. Eventually, however, developer Red Entertainment, which partnered with Sega and came up with the concept for the series, ended up experiencing financial difficulties. Meanwhile, gamers' taste started swinging toward other genres, and the video game industry also underwent a seismic shift in Japan as mobile games gained popularity. Given all those headwinds, I finally gave up hope on a new Sakura Wars game. Even after the series ranked number 1 in a Sega survey of old games that people wanted to see once again, I wasn't completely confident that Sakura Wars would be revived. As such, by the time Sega announced its intention to bring the series back, I was pleasantly surprised. Admittedly, I had some misgivings. My memories of Sakura Wars were near and dear to my heart, but it's also been such a long time since I played a game from the series. In the last few years, I also noticed that I no longer had the same feverish interest I used to with several games that I used to like. What if I've outgrown Sakura Wars as well? Those doubts, however, melted as soon as I heard the familiar opening song when I loaded up my Japanese copy of the game last year. All of a sudden, I felt like the same young kid who was studying Japanese for the first time once again, as my memories of all those previous Sakura Wars games came flooding back. I also started thinking about the game's impending Western release. Sakura Wars 5, for example, was the only game in the series that got an official English version. It was a version that I never got to play, however, so all of my experience with the series came from playing the Japanese versions of its games. I was just worried that playing the game in English just wouldn't feel the same. Fortunately, the English version worked out quite well. Granted, there are times when the localizing team takes some liberties with the translation and changes the dialogue a bit. Overall, though, I think the translators did a good job with the localization, especially given how certain words and puns don't exactly translate well to English. There were even times when I found myself spitting out laughing after reading some of the dialogue because the translation team did a great job in capturing the humor for that specific conversation. Eventually, I noticed myself reading the English text naturally as opposed to picking it apart and comparing it to what was being said through the voice dialogue in Japanese. And yes, the voice dialogue in the localized version is still in Japanese. For me, that's actually not a problem because I prefer Japanese voice acting for anime-style games like this. I also found the lack of an English dub understandable due to the cost that such an endeavor entails, especially for a series that doesn't exactly have a strong following outside of Japan. That being said, if you're someone who prefers your media to be dubbed, the lack of an English voice acting option would still be a bummer. On the plus side, you can still enjoy the narrative despite the absence of voiced English dialogue. Storytelling, after all, is a big part of the Sakura Taisen series, and the new Sakura Wars isn't any different. This time around, you play an all-new protagonist in Seijiro Kamiyama, a former Navy captain who is reassigned to a Tokyo-based anti-demon fighting force known as the Imperial Combat Review. As in past games, the members of this division double up not just as fighters, but also as theater actors who perform shows for the public. However, unlike the Imperial Combat Review's legendary Flowery division from the past games, the current group has fallen on hard times. Thanks to a lack of support from the people, the military, and the government, the Imperial Combat Review has to scrape by a meager existence. This is all happening despite Kanzaki Heavy Industries' heir and former Flowery Division fighter Sumire Kanzaki taking the helm of the organization. Let me just say, by the way, how happy I am to see Sumire appear on screen once again. Sumire was actually my favorite character from the original series, and it was nice to see her strutting around the theater like a flamboyant peacock once more. Even Sumire, however, is not a miracle worker. After pouring in her own resources into the organization, the lack of successful results has finally caught up to the struggling division. Whether it be the once impressive Grand Imperial Theater or the Flowery Division's spherical robots, everything is aging and practically falling apart. As a final act of embarrassment, the Flowery Division also has to rely on the Shanghai Combat Review to defend its own city from demon attacks due to the perceived inadequacies of the Tokyo team. It is under this depressing backdrop that Seijiro arrives on the scene and is given the task to turn the downtrodden organization around. A former rising star in the Navy, Seijiro himself has his own literal and personal demons to deal with. This makes the flawed yet promising officer the perfect captain for an equally flawed yet promising team. Like the other Sakura Wars games that came before it, the writing in this soft reboot runs the gamut from comical and lighthearted situations to more serious fare. Some of the scenes involving Seijiro's crisis of conscience every time he enters the bath area, either accidentally or on purpose, for example, legitimately cracked me up. The same can be said about the goofier dialogue choices you get when talking to the game's various characters. This includes literally bribing a kid with snacks, which worked flawlessly by the way, or making a comically off-the-mark observation about one team member having 2 pillows on her bed instead of just 1. At the same time, the story also has its share of serious moments. From the lasting impact of the Great Demon War that ravaged Tokyo 10 years ago, to dealing with the ragtag group's own feelings of inadequacy, Sakura Wars does not have a shortage of drama. Admittedly, there are times when the story resorts to tropes as well as seemingly forced conflict. The biggest issue I have as a longtime fan, however, is the way they decided to address the fate of the squad members from the past games. Although it's nice to see how heroically the members of the old Tokyo, Paris, and New York strike forces are portrayed, I also felt that they were pretty much cast aside in order to clear the way and pass the torch to the new team. Players such as myself undoubtedly invested a lot of time and emotion in these characters when we played the older games many years ago. One of the things I really looked forward to when I first heard about the new Sakura Wars game, for example, was seeing how those old characters were doing nowadays, even if it may be in a limited supporting role. With the exception of Sumire, however, they're pretty much reduced to just being in the background. The fact that you can collect bromides or images of these characters that remind you of classic scenes from past games makes it even more painful to realize that they don't have a larger presence in the game. It just feels like a wasted opportunity, especially in terms of giving fans of the past games some satisfying form of closure regarding their old favorites. As a result, I could see the approach fueling backlash among older fans of the game, especially against the new characters. This would be unfortunate, as I found the game's new cast to be quite likable. The unfortunately named Clarissa Snowflake, for example, starts out a bit annoying with her constant self-pity and pessimism. After the opening chapter, however, she quickly turned into one of my favorite characters, thanks to her ditzy secret notes, as well as her hilarious reactions to anything potentially romantic that Kamiyama tries to do. A disastrous and entirely optional public confession from Kamiyama involving dolphins comes to mind, for example. Young ninja girl Azami, meanwhile, doesn't like it when she's treated like a kid. She's also oblivious to the fact that she's totally susceptible to things that kids like, including bribes involving snacks. Knowing such personality quirks is important when talking to the various characters because they determine what dialogue choices will get a positive reaction from them during the game's interactive lips conversation system. The time dialogue choices are a staple of the Sakura Wars games and add an extra layer of interactivity compared to, say, visual novels. These interactive conversations are basically what make playing Sakura Wars a unique experience and have traditionally been the selling point of the franchise. Fiery Shrine Maiden Hatsuo, for example, typically likes strong and impulsive dialogue choices, while top actress Anastasia prefers more rational ones. Clarissa, on the other hand, typically values honesty, no matter how brutal it may be, while Sakura typically responds well to positivity and straightforward remarks. Admittedly, there are times when the lips interactions get somewhat uncomfortable and even downright creepy, particularly during the more up-close romantic interactions, where you can pat the head or poke the cheeks of whichever Flower Division maiden you're talking to. To be honest, I've never been the biggest fan of this aspect of Sakura Wars, as I'm not really into dating games in general. For the most part, though, the lips interactions are fun to deal with because they make you think. These include times when you have to accomplish tasks like investigating a scene or remembering orders over a set period of time while a timer runs on the screen. Other examples include deciding whether to speak with force by pushing the analog stick up, or whispering out your comment instead by pushing it down. You definitely want to do well with the lip sections because picking the right answer can raise your team members' trust level with Kamiyama. Conversely, picking the wrong answer will cause them to lose trust instead, which can bite you in the butt later on. Having high trust makes characters who fight with you perform better in battle, for example, and can even unlock hidden conversations or rewards with other characters once their trust reaches a certain level. At the same time, I wish that the characters' backstories were a bit more fleshed out. Sakura gets most of the attention, which is understandable as she's the main heroine. Although the motivations of the other characters are explained, however, they don't get the same level of exposition in their backgrounds. Older games used to really delve into a character's backstory once their individual episodes came up. In the new Sakura Wars, however, the character episodes are typically mixed in with other plot points so you don't get the same expository detail as in past games. As a result, character development can feel a bit rushed at times. Free time or free movement segments, meanwhile, also make a return, allowing you to walk around the theater as well as other destinations around Tokyo. Doing so can lead to conversations with the various characters, trigger special events, or uncover pictures of the cast that are hidden in specific locations. While I like how you're able to visit a bunch more areas instead of being limited to the theater, I also wish that the segments involving these places were fleshed out as well. I liked one part, for example, where you're dressed as the theater mascot Peanut and have to juggle doing advertising for the theater while also looking for a team member who you need to track down at the same time. Another interactive event I liked involved exposing and catching a thief by observing certain clues in various areas and then picking the culprit from a line of suspects. Most of the time, however, you don't do that kind of stuff and just simply drop into an area, talk to someone, and then that's it. Another fan favorite that makes a return is the Sakura Taisen minigame. It was certainly fun to be able to play Japanese Hanafuda card games once again with the game's various characters who you have to unlock in the course of playing the game. One thing I noticed though is that the new Sakura Wars does not have the same number of minigames as past entries in the series. It would have been nice, for example, if each character had their own unique game, even if they happen to be just rehashes of older minigames that have appeared in the series before. It's not essential, but it was one of the things that I typically associate with a Sakura Wars game. I do appreciate the addition of the BattleBot simulator, however, which allows you to play battle simulations based on the new combat system, while also unlocking character pictures in the process. The new combat system, by the way, is one of the potential controversial changes in Sakura Wars. In past games, every episode ends with a tactical battle that used to be done in a strategy RPG style. Sakura Wars gets rid of that, however, for real-time hack-and-slash combat instead. Some fans of the older strategy system might decry the decision. Then again, this change was likely done to make the game more appealing to a wider audience. The combat itself is like a mix of Dynasty Warriors with some Bayonetta-style bullet times thrown in when you dodge at the last second. A patch that was released prior to release day also added the ability to lock on to enemies. This is a huge help because it was a pain to keep track of enemies, and it was also easy for your super attacks to miss prior to the lock-on patch. When facing a bunch of enemies, you can also cycle through them by moving the right analog stick left or right. Admittedly, the fights can get a bit repetitive, especially when going against mobs. To make things interesting, the game has a gauge that you can build up by performing certain actions like perfect evades and link attacks. Filling up the gauge improves your performance in battle and also affects your final grade, so you want to get it as high as possible every time. On the plus side, combat becomes much more interesting when fighting stronger foes one-on-one or facing the game's bosses. Bosses, for example, typically have a certain gimmick that you need to figure out, such as destroying all its parts at the same time in order to stagger it. Others, such as major antagonist Yaksha, try to overwhelm you with speed and power, and you will need to master perfect evasions in order to take them down. You're also graded during fights based on factors such as your clear time, how much damage you inflicted, and the number of enemies you destroyed. Add the various combat styles of the different Flower Division members, and the combat actually becomes quite fun once you get the hang of it. Kamiyama's dual sword melee style, for example, is intuitive to use and feels rewarding. Azami's quick-striking ninjutsu, on the other hand, makes it easier to time perfect evasions. Anastasia's ranged hits, meanwhile, feel satisfying, and her use of an old-school umbrella when she soars in the air is a nice added touch that looks cool to boot. Naturally, super attacks also look flashy, and powerful combination attacks between the squad captain and the various Flower Division maidens also make a return. One issue I have with the combat is how combos can cause you or the enemy that you're attacking to fall off ledges. This can get annoying because you have to wait for enemies that fall to respawn back up before you can take them down, which wastes valuable time that can affect your final grade in battle. Speaking of bosses, one of the things that this game doesn't do quite as well as the past games is fleshing out its rogues gallery. Past games gave you a sense that you're up against a serious group of foes and made the enemies look more compelling. In this new Sakura Wars game, the major enemies feel like they're just, well, kind of there for the most part. Yaksha could be perhaps considered the exception, largely because his look is reminiscent of an old character from the past games. Outside of her, however, the other enemies just aren't that interesting and look and act like caricatures for the most part. The major boss mechs, meanwhile, look great but are also few in numbers. A few of them even get recycled multiple times, which takes off the sheen from fighting them once again. One plus is that the game really does a great job with its presentation and visuals. The old games in the series were designed to look like a playable anime, and Sakura Wars tries to do the same thing with its cel-shaded 3D models and anime-style approach, which uses the character designs from Bleach artist Kubo this time around. There is a bit of a disconnect between the in-game models and the anime cutscenes, however, since they look a bit different. There are also times when you get a bit of an uncanny valley effect with the character faces. The game tends to reuse assets for NPCs as well, which quickly becomes noticeable. Overall though, I like the game's look, which essentially modernizes the style of past games. I especially like the models for the characters and the spherical striker robots, which look fantastic. Ultimately, while Sakura Wars doesn't quite reach the lofty heights set by its predecessors, it remains a worthy attempt at not only resurrecting the long-dormant franchise, but also modernizing it for a new audience. Yes, I still wish that it incorporated the old characters better, but its new protagonists also fit the franchise well, and I found myself quickly developing an affinity for them. Series purists might also prefer the old tactical RPG approach from the first few games, or the Valkyria Chronicles style combat used by later games in the series. Although the new real-time action combat is a bit derivative, however, it's still enjoyable once you get the hang of it. Despite the flaws of Sakura Wars, there really are no other games like this, and I'm glad to see it back once again. The new Sakura Wars feels like a Sakura Wars game, which is the best compliment that a longtime fan such as myself could give it. There really isn't a game out there quite like it, and I think the developers should be commended for releasing a game like this one, despite the risk that it entails, especially when compared to more popular genres. If the idea of fun interactive storytelling, mixed with a nice helping of steampunk and robot hijinks, sounds good to you, then Sakura Wars just might blossom into your kind of game. Once again, this is Tabi Asobi, and thank you for watching.
せーの勝利のポーズ決め